schools in England may reopen region by region after half-term. Speaking to the Commons Education Committee, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Dr Jenny Harries, suggested there would be different rates of infection across the country when lockdown ends, which would mean a different application of restrictions. Justine Greening is a former Conservative Education Secretary and is founder of the Social Mobility Pledge. Good morning to you.
Morning.
And what about this idea of schools reopening at different times according to infection rates? I mean, ultimately, they're all following the same curriculum. Will some be at an advantage compared to others if that happens?
I think it's inevitable that we'll come out of the COVID crisis with some children and young people having had more learning and education during the past year and others having had far less. And we're at the stage now whether the fact that schools may be closed for maybe 42 weeks rather than 40 weeks in some areas, it underlines the fact that actually what we need from government now is a much more comprehensive catch-up plan so that however much time children have missed and all children have had their education disrupted, we can make sure that they don't end up paying the long-term price for this pandemic as a generation. And I think there's a real challenge now that we haven't seen any sort of additional funding for education in relation to a catch-up plan really since the summer, and it's months ago. And of course, the disruption to education has become far deeper since then.
The other problem, of course, is this idea of mass testing, because this is something that the government floated and said, well, you know, one of the ways we'll be able to get schools back and reopened is if obviously some people in the community have been vaccinated, but also we're going to mass test. If you look at the front page of The Guardian today, this plan, which had been hailed as a milestone, it doesn't look like it's going to happen anymore because the UK's medicines regulator hadn't authorised the daily use of rapid turnaround tests as an alternative to self-isolation anyway. How much of a spanner in the works is that, do you think?
I think it's another indicator that we can't have the Department for Education issuing edicts to schools that it hasn't fully looked at in terms of whether they're feasible to deliver for school leaders on the ground. And I think this has been a challenge the whole way through, where too often we've seen proposals made at the last minute and that they've been very hard for head teachers and teachers more widely to put in place. What ministers need to do is pull together not only a catch-up plan, but a wider plan on levelling up through education, but one that's actually worked through with the education professionals themselves, with schools, and is tailored to reflect the fact that different schools and different young people have had very different levels of education over the past month. It's about having a bolted down plan. And I think it needs to go beyond that across government. Boris Johnson's government talked about levelling up. This government now needs to not only have a catch-up plan and levelling up plan on education, but bring those forward for other parts of our lives where we see the gaps open up. That means we don't all get the same chance to have the same opportunities in life. And I think the sooner that Boris Johnson's government can set that out, I think the sooner we can make sure the Treasury then brings forward the investment we need and that we have the proper planning to be actually able to put those plans into action.
The area of education seems to have been really fraught with difficulty. I mean, you'll know, over the summer, so many U-turns over exams and all sorts of stuff. Free school meals has been a bit of a problem too for the government. Is it just because so many people are invested in education, so many different types of groups, parents, unions, teachers, politicians, or is there something specific about this government that has not been able to grasp the situation?
I think the challenge has been resourcing. In the end, what the DfE can't do is write blank cheques, and the Treasury has had a strategy of whatever it takes on protecting current opportunities, in other words, jobs in the economy. I think that's been the right approach, but it's taken a very different approach when it's come to protecting our children's education and opportunities in the future. And I think so you've seen these political arguments over what, by comparison to furlough and other investments made by Treasury, have been very small investments, but that make a big difference for the children and families that would have benefited from them, which is why you need to have this bigger plan. I think the big danger for ministers is they see neither the wood nor the trees. And if they don't actually stand back and have a full plan on catching up, how they come back to this issue of levelling up and the fact that gaps open up in lives during the education system, but also then beyond. If they don't have a clear vision, if you like, of where they're trying to get to, then it's going to be very hard for them to have a plan about how they then make that transition and tackle these challenges. And I think that's what we've seen on education. You did see health have a clear national effort to make sure the NHS could get through the pandemic crisis. I don't believe you've seen government mobilise in that same way, triggering a national effort on education to make sure that schools can keep going. And I think it's that much wider fix that we now need to see ministers shape, and it's absolutely crucial. I went through the state system. Most people listening to this programme will have done. We all know how important education is for being able to unlock opportunity in our lives, and we can't let this generation of young people have their long-term futures damaged for want of a proper plan from ministers and government.
As you say, you've done the job. Gavin Williamson seems to be struggling a bit. I think that's fair to say, because there have been many U-turns and accusations of government not listening to teachers and head teachers. Should he step aside now? Labour is saying that he should, or is this not the right time for a change in personnel?
I think it's not as simple as that. And the point I'm making is that actually, in a way, whose name is on the nameplate going into the DfE is actually less important than the fact that that department, supported by the wider government, actually knows what it's going to do to help our children and young people catch up their education, and then to have a broader plan on closing those gaps that were already there. But of course, COVID has made much wider those inequalities that were already in our education system. That's what's missing at the moment. And I think my other point would be, whatever you bring forward for education, it needs to sit as part of a much bigger strategy from government. Perhaps we can call them levelling up goals that are being pursued in terms of not just policy, but ones that civil society, that businesses, that individuals can also support. We saw how galvanizing, for example, the Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals were for getting actors around the world to work on tackling poverty and development. I think we need a similar strategy and focus now for levelling up if we're going to make that happen across the UK.
Justine Greening, thank you very much for that.